Hey, this is Rick Myrup, and welcome to Around the Farm, where we're going to be talking about all things agriculture. This afternoon, joining me in the studio, we've got Sam Eathington, who leads the science organization at the Climate Corporation. How you doing today, Sam?
Doing great, Rick.
Hey, really excited to have you in studio today to talk about something that is top of mind for a lot of folks in ag as an industry. You can't throw a stone without finding somebody that's talking about the concept of benchmarking, right? We see this in a lot of other industries, whether it's the finance industry, other industries that are comparing using benchmarks as a way for people to understand what they're getting or what performance looks like. And it's a truly unique opportunity we've got here to have someone with your science background to help us to understand this concept of benchmarking a little bit better and how farmers can really use data and performance to understand how to make decisions as they move into the future. You know, Sam, I know you've been with us on the show before, but if you don't mind, for our listeners who maybe didn't catch previous podcasts, would you mind telling them a little bit about your background and how you got here?
Yeah, absolutely. So Sam Eathington, I'm Chief Science Officer here at Climate Corporation. I've been around climate about 4 years now, figuring out this data world and how do we turn it into some sort of actionable insight for our customers. I have a long history in ag, grew up on a farm, still have the pleasure of farming a little bit with my brothers, and spent about 20 years in the ag industry working on plant breeding and genetics. So I live and breathe agriculture, and this is just the next phase of cool stuff coming in ag.
Well, hey, let's not bury the lead here and let's get right to it, right? A lot of folks in the industry talking about benchmarking. A lot of folks asking for farmers to upload data, subscribe to their service, down the line. You recently authored a article on precision ag and benchmarking. Can you talk to us a little bit about that article and what you were trying to share with folks in the industry?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you said, we hear a lot about benchmarking, and there's a lot of claims sometimes made about benchmarking, what it can and maybe can't do for you on your farming operation. And so I thought it'd be good to take our data out of FieldView and actually explain a little bit more to our customers, to our farmers, how to think about benchmarking. And here's the simple way that people ought to look at it. At the highest level, benchmarking is nothing more than just summarizing your data, right? You got a whole bunch of data, say, about your farming operation, yields of your hybrids, maybe your planting dates, maybe when you sprayed, et cetera, et cetera. And you can summarize that information. You can aggregate it with a whole bunch of other farmers. Some might be your neighbors. Some might be in your same county or state level. And some might actually be quite a few states away. And get a look at, hey, how did my farm perform relative to the aggregate of farms? How is my decision about planting date compared to decisions other farmers are making? And the key thing in the article was, if you're making comparators about what actions I did, maybe what equipment I have, what hybrids I plant, those are okay, right? They're very good things to do to say, hey, I planted 50 acres of this hybrid, I planted on these dates, what did you do? And it's a neat way to understand other agriculture activities and what your neighbors are doing, what the industry is doing, et cetera. The challenge, though, is when we start to want to ask questions like, hey, I have hybrid A and hybrid B, and I want to know which one yielded more. And typically, you'll see benchmarks roll-ups where they'll aggregate all the data, and hybrid A wins by 20 bushels, and everybody says, yeah, hybrid A is the better hybrid. And we basically said, hey, there's a lot of problems when you want to start making those types of comparisons. And we can talk about confounding issues and bias. And those are the two elements that people need to deal with.
So I just want to stop you for a second there, Sam, because, listen, I don't have as many degrees as you do. You know, when you talk about bias and confounding issues, talk to me a little bit about, what do those terms mean?
Yeah, no, great point. So let's start with confounding issues. So let's say, both of us are farming and you plant hybrid A on some really high productivity soil and you got an extra couple inches of rain. You maybe put a fungicide on, And I had hybrid B, and I didn't get the rain. I didn't put a fungicide on. And so all of a sudden, when we compare hybrid A to hybrid B, we're not just comparing how those two hybrids performed. We're also comparing, you got some additional rain and you did a fungicide on your trial, and I didn't. And if you think about that, that becomes extremely complex. When you think about the dozens and dozens of different things we could do on our farming operations, decisions, different molecules we use, etc., it becomes so complicated that your ability to extract out of the data what is the true effect of comparing hybrid A to hybrid B is really difficult, right? And we can talk a little later, though. There are ways you can do it, right? So confounding all these other farming decisions, weather, soil, you name it, all get rolled into there. The bias part comes into, for example, let's say I buy a bag of seed that costs me, $250, and I buy a bag of seed that costs me, $190. And I farm very different levels of productivity across my operation. Some fields might yield 250 on normal. Some fields might yield 150 on normal. Well, my tendency is to take my high-price seed and plant it on my more productive fields and my low-price seed on my low-productive fields because I'm trying to manage my total input cost relative to my expected outcome. Well, when I make that comparison, hybrid A that got planted on really productive soils has much more yield potential than hybrid B that got planted on low productivity soils. And it's partially because of the price of the seed. So we see that in the data sets all the time. And we thought it was important to try to put a little bit down in an article to explain it to people.
Thanks, Matt. I appreciate that. It's interesting to hear you put it that way. When you talk about it, it seems perfectly logical, right? If I'm going to compare two seeds, I've got to think about all the different things that impact that. And to your point, there are a numerous number of things that can really have an impact on that. And even if it's a similar soil type that's 50 miles away, the weather patterns that went through there, folks are living that problem today, right? In a span of 50 miles, you could have had a violently different precipitation amount this spring. So interesting to hear about that. So that's a problem for us because we've heard from so many different places and in so many different industries, hey, you want to be benchmarking, you want to learn about this stuff. If that's a problem for ag because of these confounding factors and the biases that you're talking about there, what should we be doing there to understand what the best products are and what products provided the ROI that we were hoping for?
Yeah, no, great question. And let me break it down in a couple of different points. The first thing which every grower has basically control of is run the experiments on your farm. And FieldView is really there to let you make simple experiments and really analyze those results on your farm. So for example, and we see this on a bunch of our farmers, in fact, about 45% of our customers out there today are doing this, is run a split planter trial. If you have hybrid A and hybrid B and you can split your planter, lines up with your corn row head, and you can go ahead and harvest those rows of different hybrid independently, you actually take a lot of the confounding factors out of that comparison, and you get a true measurement of did hybrid A out-yield hybrid B in my farming operation. And the way we've thought about it on our operation is, hey, do that on a number of fields. You might do that on some of your very productive fields. You might do that on some of your lower productivity fields. So you can see how that hybrid difference changes across maybe productivity, or maybe you want to do it with different fertility situations or different fungicide treatments, whatever you think is important in your operation. So run the experiment on your farm, set it up in FieldView. You can measure it real simple, and you actually get a non-confounded effect right there immediately in your trial.
Sam, it's interesting. You're talking about understanding performance on my farm, running the test, and seeing how that works. I got to be honest with you. There's a lot of marketing claims out there in the industry right now that says, hey, take advantage of big data. Take advantage of all of this information that's coming in. It's going to educate you. You're going to be able to know more about it. What are some of the challenges that you see? They're obviously selling on this. Some folks are purchasing into this. What are some of the challenges that you see around benchmarking that might lead to a poor decision for a farmer?
Yeah, again, what I tend to see is we talk a lot about big data. We tend to put a wrapper around a lot of digital tools. And when you really dig into them, and that's what I would encourage farmers to do, is really dig into some of these tools, you actually find there's not that much data behind the scenes. And again, it goes back to if you have very limited amount of data, these confounding effects and the bias that are naturally there can actually give you the wrong decision. And that was one of the things we showed in our analysis was we took a large data set of split planter data against what would be a typical benchmarking analysis. And there was essentially no correlation. And what that means is if you're using benchmarking to tell you hybrid A is better than hybrid B, it's basically random, right? And we should not be, making decisions on our farming operations based on randomness. We actually should be letting data drive and tell us what to do. So there's great opportunity there. And it really, some of the next things we're working on will demonstrate more value. But in the short term, run those trials on your farm and set them up and make your comparisons.
What I'm hearing you say here is that not all data is created equal. And really understanding the source of that is going to be important for our listeners out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And how that data is assembled, and you don't have to have an advanced degree in data analysis. Just think about even your own operation. We farm north-south, 20-mile span. Of course, it rains different between the north and south part of our operation. And trying to compare a hybrid we planted up north to a hybrid down south, we got problems in that comparison. So it's no different, even though someone calls it a benchmarking tool.
You've been talking about running the split plant trials, doing the tests on your operation. What can farmers do today to improve their ability to understand performance as they're thinking about setting up those types of trials or even considering what types of things they want to compare and measure?
Yeah, the way we think about it is, start with your best possible seed recommendations. And so we have built our Seed Advisor tool, which assembles all this data and turns it into an actual prediction. And that prediction we've validated over multiple years of field studies. And so I can walk onto your farm and say, hey, based on your farming pattern and operations, the best set of hybrids for you to grow are these, say, 5 hybrids. And you may look at that, or your trusted advisor may look at that, or your dealer may look at it and say, well, I'm not sure about hybrid number 4, haven't seen that before. Maybe I heard there was a little bit of a problem with it. Well, go ahead and run the split planter. Set up that experiment. Test it on your operation. Compare it against what you think is your proven hybrids. And that's a great way for you to now really test, how good our models are, validate the additional performance we think we're going to give you, and learn on your farming operation what you should do. And I'm using a seed as an example, but the reality is that could be applied to crop protection molecules, fertility, even your own farming practices and tillage operations, what you want to do.
Sam, I've been talking to a lot of folks, and there's a lot of excitement around digital agriculture and the way that it's evolving things and how theoretically it's going to make life easier, right? It's going to help us to make decisions. What I'm hearing you say here today is, hey, some of these tools that are out there may not be pointing us in the right direction. I know that you've got a strong team of folks working with you at the Climate Corporation on the science team. Are there things that are coming down the pipeline that are going to help us to be more efficient in understanding performance and better be able to understand how to make the most optimal decision, especially in a challenging economy like we have today?
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of the second wave of research we're working on kind of falls in this space we'll call machine learning in real general terms. But it goes like this, that when you bring in enough data around, say, hybrid genetics and how they yield, and you associate all that data with all the weather information that occurred on each and every field, and you associate that with all the soil types and all the farming practices and fertility and fungicide application, you actually get to let the computer teach you about how hybrids perform. And we're now been running some of these models the last year or so where assembling, tens to hundreds of millions of acres of data and letting the computer figure out the agronomics that are going on, right? Letting it understand how to best predict that yield. And what that gets you to is a world where it's not only useful in when you need to make a decision, like, for example, should I spray a fungicide molecule today? The computer starts to say, well, here's the probability of getting a return if you made that decision today. It also becomes the framework of rules about how to make comparisons, how to do benchmarking in a smarter way across all this data. Now, here's the irony of it, right? If you've studied some of these machine learning models, sometimes they're hard to understand, right?
I can totally relate to that. There is a lot that I don't understand about that.
I look at some of our simpler models that are trying to decide what disease is on your corn leaf, for example, and there's tens of 20s of millions of different variables that flow into that algorithm. In a lot of cases, we don't actually understand what some of those variables are. When you look at them, you're not sure how to interpret them. So my point here is this complex agronomy that we're in of how to grow crops out there in this environment is just that. It's extremely complicated. But all this data ultimately lets the computer start to figure out that complexity, and there will be things in there that we don't understand. Hey, we didn't understand that weather, when it interacts with fertility on this hybrid and this soil type, really does very different sort of response. But that's what we're going to learn and figure out. We're not there yet today. But when you get there, that becomes the ultimate way to do benchmarking.
Sam, let me ask you this. Ag is a notoriously hard to predict industry, right? Abnormal is the new normal. Every year we've got something new to contend with in different geographies. If you look in your crystal ball and you start to project out into the future and where this science can take us, where data capture can take us, are we going to go to a place where there eventually is a right answer? Or is there always going to be some degree of uncertainty that's going to come with producing in agriculture?
Yeah, there's always going to be uncertainty. We don't predict, nor do we control the weather. Every once in a while, people say, oh, you're a climate corporation, you must be controlling the weather. We don't. And, some of the best state-of-the-art weather models, have decent ability out 10 days, 2 weeks.
Well, your definition of decent's a little rough. I'd like to be a weather person so that I could be wrong half the time and still get to keep my job.
Yeah, fair point. But it's still, on the whole, the predictions are good enough that they change the probabilities of the outcomes, right? And that's really ultimately what we're after is I have to make a series of decisions in farming. And if in every decision I increase my probability of success, then I get essentially the cumulative multiplication of all those improved decisions. And that's ultimately where we'll be, but it will be a world of, hey, there's an 80% chance you're going to get a return on this fungicide if you spray now, given your crop, given your disease level, given the next, say, 2 weeks of weather forecasts. It means it's going to be wrong some of the time, but I'll take an 80% win rate over random every day.
Sam, you're talking in a language that's a little bit different than I'm used to, right? Typically, when we talk to folks in industry that are selling products, they're talking to us about how great the product is and how it's going to yield and it's going to produce and it's going to be profitable for me. You're talking about this much more in terms of, hey, sometimes it's going to work, sometimes it's not going to work. What we want to do is steer you towards the greater probability of that thing working. You sit at an interesting spot, right? You talked about how your family's got a farm, still active on the farm. However, you're also on the cutting edge of science in this industry as well. So, from where you sit, this interesting nexus of practical implementation and cutting edge science development. What advice would you give to farmers that have tried to use benchmarking at this point or have tried to use some of these different tools out there? What would you tell them as they think about how to manage their operations today that takes into consideration both the practical viewpoint of a farmer while also thinking about your strengths and knowledge as a chief scientist for Bayer?
Yeah, I'd give farmers two pieces of advice there. One is, hey, if you want to know simple things like how many acres a hybrid got planted or what planting date was averaged in your area and where you rank as far as how big your farm is, hey, benchmarking is a great way to go do that. If you want to start understanding what's the value of making a decision about hybrid A versus hybrid B or spraying a fungicide, I would tell you most, in fact, all the benchmarking tools that are out there today are have the risk of just basically giving you a random answer. And that's what our analysis clearly showed in the paper we put together. And so I would tell you, run experiments on your farm and use tools that are really driven from data to create predictions on your farm. Like our Seed Advisor is really designed to predict what is the best hybrid for your field. And if you're not sure about our predictions, then go ahead and test it. And that's the beauty of FieldView, bringing transparency to agriculture and making it simple for farmers to run those experiments. So if you want some general basic stuff, go for it. If you want to know real effects, decisions you should make, you need to get into real experimentation and real prediction tools.
Sam, one of the things that always gets people a little bit leery about experimentation, though, is it's doing something new, right? Oftentimes, some things will get recommended, and I've heard guys kind of chuckle and say, "We've never done it that way. I'm not going to try it that way. There's too much at stake." What advice or what insight would you give to folks that are a little bit leery about trying different or new agronomic practices and keeping themselves safe and whole while also creating the opportunity to learn and potentially create increased profit?
Yeah, I tell people to start with the simplest stuff first. Start with stuff that you maybe have interest in learning more about or even changing on your operation. So, for example, look, you're going to buy seed every year, and you've got to make a decision about what seed to buy. You're getting a lot of advice from dealer and seed salesmen and maybe your neighbors and maybe even the son or daughter that came back from school. But it's easy enough to go ahead with relatively little extra work to go ahead and set up some split planter trials and run those comparisons, test different hybrids. Start small, put it on 2 or 3 fields. You don't need to flip the whole farming operation right off the bat and learn from that. Learn how to do that. And from there, it's pretty easy to get into, well, should I do a fungicide? Leave it unsprayed check strip. Should I do some different density or fertility? In fact, I'll tell a quick story. I was getting my brother to do some density trials, and one of our old planters does not have variable rate. So I made him actually get off and change sprockets across the field to get different density experiments across the field.
I bet you were really popular with him, weren't you?
I was not at all popular. But the learning was, hey, actually it worked. And their takeaway was, shoot, we should be putting more seed in these parts of the fields and less in these other parts of the field. And while that took more time for them to plant and probably not something we'd do at scale, it gave them information about, as they think about the equipment turnover, which will happen on the farm, should we go ahead and invest in variable rate scripting for the future? And they have some now real-time data on their farm that says, yeah, we could actually see an effect. It's probably wise for us to do that as we think about swapping out that planter.
Be honest, you enjoyed teaching your brother a lesson there, didn't you? Did you drop an "I told you so" on him?
I tend to drop a lot of pins in FieldView, and they tend to ignore me. So it's always great dealing with family.
Well, hey, Sam, we talked a lot about this article. If our listeners want to learn more about it, where can they find that thing?
Yeah, I think you can find that article out there on climate.com or precisionag.com.
Thanks, Sam. We'll go ahead and put that in the podcast notes so that people can find that and reference that article if they'd like to. Sam, appreciate you taking the time with us here this afternoon. Really insightful to learn more about benchmarking and how it can actually lead us in the wrong direction if we're not paying attention to the data that's there and being included in that. Makes total sense when you think about it. I mean, a simple guy like me, I've learned about confounding factors and bias today too, and how those things can really impact that analysis. It seems that where we're sitting today, some of the best things that we can still be doing is running split plant trials and understanding performance and really continuing to test these new tools that are coming out into the marketplace to help us to make recommendations or to make decisions on farm and ultimately improve productivity. So appreciate you taking the time today, Sam.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Rick. Pleasure being here.
Well, hey, as always, want to say thank you to our listeners who tuned in. Don't miss any of our episodes. I know you wouldn't want to. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find us at www.climate.com. We want to hear from you. If you have any thoughts or questions, go to Twitter, search for FieldView. You can find us there and then use the hashtag FieldViewATF so that we can find your tweets, and we'll do our best to answer your questions because honestly, you guys come up with the best ideas. Speaking of feedback, we wouldn't be opposed to getting that great 5-star review. If you send them our way, we greatly appreciate it. That's all we've got for today. We'll see you around the farm.